The chilling events began in 2005 in an apartment building in Taiwan. A young man who lived alone suddenly heard strange noises coming from the unit directly above his. They began as a muffled commotion, quickly followed by a terrifying scream. He felt a surge of confusion about what could be happening, but truthfully, he wasn't concerned enough to investigate. It was only 2 days later that he realized the incident in his neighbor's apartment had not been a mere dispute. It had been an absolute catastrophe. And yet, what happened upstairs would soon become the subject of a case that, while perhaps relatively short in duration, absolutely captivated me. It is a truly terrifying incident, and that is the absolute least I can say about it. I won't keep you waiting any longer. Let's dive right into the story. The story truly begins on April 9th, 2005, in the city of Kaohsiung, Taiwan. A young man returned to his apartment from work and immediately settled down in front of the television, flipping through channels with bored impatience, searching for anything to capture his attention. The day had been dull, and the programs were equally uninteresting. As he surfed, he started to hear a low rumble of noise from the unit above him. At first, he paid it no mind, but the sound quickly began to intensify. It sounded like heavy stomping or something repeatedly falling to the floor. He hit the mute button on his remote and began to listen with focused attention to the ceiling above. As he concentrated, he noticed the sounds weren't just impacts. They were interspersed with a choral chanting, as if multiple voices were repeating the same phrase in unison. While this might alarm most people, the young man was surprisingly unconcerned. He knew that the residents upstairs were the Hu family, and they were known throughout the building for their extreme eccentricities. They belonged to a particular religious sect, and their worship involved bizarre rituals. These ceremonies often included celebratory dances and synchronized chants, which required them to jump, stomp, and utter their strange phrases. While the noise was a constant annoyance to all their neighbors, especially the young man living directly beneath them, he had never once complained. He understood that this was simply their peculiar, non-malicious form of worship, and he was content to leave them be. So, as he always did, he quickly processed the familiar sound. It's just the Hu family's rituals again, and returned to his TV, attempting to completely tune them out. But this time was different. The stomping and chanting grew louder, more aggressive, and more frantic than ever before. The commotion from the neighbor's apartment was absolutely impossible to ignore. It became so deafening that even with the television volume turned up to its highest setting, the roar from above could not be drowned out. Then, amidst the chaotic noise, he finally heard it. A scream. It was a piercing, extremely loud shriek coming from directly above, and it made him freeze in place. He immediately turned off the television once more, because this was the first time, ever, he had heard a scream during their rituals. What kind of religious ceremony involves a shriek so raw, as if a soul is being dragged from a body? Something felt profoundly wrong and entirely illogical. Setting aside the fact that the noise was simply bothersome, he was now genuinely worried that someone might have been hurt. He quickly left his apartment, intent on walking up to the neighbor's unit to check on them and see what exactly was happening. But the instant he opened his door, he noticed that all the sounds had ceased completely. Following that single, piercing scream, the apartment above was perfectly silent. The eerie quiet settled over the building. He looked up, wondering what he should do. He strained to hear any sound at all, but there was nothing. Assuming the entire strange ordeal was finally over, he closed his door, went back inside, and once again completely ignored the matter, resuming his time in front of the TV. 2 days later, on April 11th, The young man once again returned from work and began watching television. This time, he was interrupted by the sound of a new commotion, a loud, aggressive knocking. But the pounding wasn't coming from his upstairs neighbors. It was right on his own front door. He immediately got up and rushed to open it. Standing before him was a middle-aged man named Kaohsiung, the man who had been beating vigorously on the door. Kaohsiung was known to the young resident as the family's spiritual advisor, or shaman. The young man was immediately confused. Why was the upstairs family's spiritual leader knocking on his door now? Compounding his confusion was Kaohsiung's utterly terrifying appearance. Dressed completely in black robes from head to toe, the man had lost a tremendous amount of weight. He was extremely pale, skin and bone, and his clothes were filthy, coated in every kind of grime imaginable. Ash, leftover food, and even human waste. His odor was utterly foul. The young man was shocked. He immediately asked the shaman, "Are you all right? Do you need help? What happened to you?" Kaohsiung remained completely silent as the younger man spoke. Suddenly, all the strange events from 2 days prior flooded back into the young man's mind. The unusual noises, the excessive loudness, the sound of something heavy falling. And finally, the singular, raw scream. He began to connect the dots, realizing with a cold certainty that all of these events must be related to the family, this unsettling figure standing right outside his apartment. Kaohsiung, the shaman, finally broke his silence, uttering only one strange sentence to the young man, a sentence that deepened the mystery. He simply commanded, "Call an ambulance." Immediately afterward, Kaohsiung turned and bolted, sprinting down the staircase and fleeing the entire building. His black, cloak-like robes billowed dramatically behind him as he fled, making the entire sight terrifying and completely surreal. The young man was left utterly bewildered. Kaohsiung had instructed him to call emergency services, and 2 days prior, he had heard the screams and the bizarre commotion. He was convinced that something terrible had happened. However, he decided not to overreact and immediately call an ambulance. Instead, he chose to first go upstairs and check on his neighbors himself. He needed to verify the situation, to see if the Hu family was actually in distress and if the circumstances truly warranted an emergency call, or if they were merely home and unharmed. The young man wasted no time. He quickly closed his door and started ascending the stairs. For the very first time, he found himself standing before the Hu family's apartment. As soon as he stepped outside his own unit, he had begun to catch the repulsive, foul odor. The very same stench that had clung to the shaman, Kaohsiung, moments earlier. He knocked on the door, but received no answer. The apartment was enveloped in a profound silence. He knocked harder and waited, but still. No reply, no sound of movement. His concern sharpened into genuine alarm. Placing a hand over his nose to try and shield himself from the overwhelming odor, he decided to open the door himself. It wasn't locked. He pushed the door inward and stepped hesitantly inside, his anxiety mounting. He began to walk through the apartment, calling out to the occupants, using their names, or simply calling for anyone. But no one answered. The smell inside was exponentially worse. It was so strong he felt like he was physically suffocating. The apartment itself was a nightmare. It was a complete pigsty, a literal landfill. The floor was covered in rotting food, garbage, and even human excrement, as if they had intentionally tried to foul the place. The stench was unbearable. He continued to search and call out, but still silence. He walked toward the living room, and what he saw lying on the center of the floor shocked him into a state of frozen terror. It turned out that 2 days before the young man heard the terrifying commotion, the family had been performing one of their usual religious rituals. But on that specific night, events spiraled horrifically out of control and led directly to the catastrophe. The ritual had turned deadly because of a tragedy brewing in the weeks leading up to the ceremony. One of the Hu family's daughters, a young woman, had fallen seriously ill. Since the family was extremely poor, they could not afford to take her to a doctor, and her condition was worsening day by day. After weeks passed and their daughter showed no improvement, despite their attempts to treat her with traditional and herbal remedies, her health continued to deteriorate rapidly. Driven by their unusual religious beliefs, the Hu family developed a terrifying conviction. Their daughter was not sick, but was instead possessed by a demon. They believed her body was fine, but her soul was the host of the ailment. Completely convinced that their daughter was suffering from demonic possession, they began performing a multitude of exorcism rituals in a desperate attempt to drive the entity out. When the daughter did not improve, the family took it as a sign that the spirit remained. Worse yet, every single member of the family began to believe that they too had become victims of demonic possession. The entire household was consumed by the terror that demons were inhabiting them, and that they all had to be urgently expelled. On the very night the young neighbor heard the banging and screaming, the family was engaged in a collective ritual of expulsion. This ceremony was truly horrific. Based on their archaic beliefs, they had become convinced that the one thing that terrified demons was filth. In a desperate attempt to create an intolerable environment for the spirits, they began to foul their apartment with garbage and human waste, simultaneously covering themselves in it. They hoped the demons inhabiting their bodies would be so disgusted by the squalor that they would vacate and seek cleaner hosts. They were all stomping, screaming, uttering bizarre incantations, and covering themselves in a hysterical frenzy. And then, things took a monstrous turn. In their shared madness, they began to ingest their own waste. They would eat the excrement, vomit it back up, and then repeat the cycle, trying to contaminate themselves both internally and externally. This horrific ritual continued for hours, with the family engaging in this insane, hysterical self-defilement. When the neighbor entered the apartment 2 days later, what he saw lying in the center of the filthy, refuse-strewn living room was their daughter, the one who had been ill. She was stretched out on the floor, dead. He immediately called the police and an ambulance. The subsequent autopsy revealed that the daughter had suffocated on the waste and vomit. Her family had remained in the house for the day the death occurred and the following day. But once they realized their daughter was dead and beyond their help, they sent for Kaohsiung, the shaman, to somehow help revive her. Since she was clearly deceased, the entire family fled the apartment. Kaohsiung was the last one to leave. Overwhelmed by a sense of guilt for abandoning the dead girl, he descended the stairs, still covered in the filth from the rituals he had participated in, and knocked on the young man's door, instructing him to call for emergency services before making his own escape. The young man had done exactly that. He called the authorities, confirming the dreadful scene he had found upstairs. A few days later, the authorities successfully tracked down the filthy family and arrested every single member. Their trial began, but here lay the problem. The law could not hold them accountable. The defense argued that the family members were suffering from a psychological state called collective hysteria, a phenomenon where one person's hysteria affects the entire group, leading to a shared delusion and ultimately disaster. They concluded that the daughter's death was an accident, not a homicide. She died as a direct consequence of the rituals they compelled her to participate in, but they hadn't directly killed her. Consequently, every single family member was released from custody, with no punishment or conviction. In my view, however, they are ultimately responsible for her death. Collective hysteria or not, they chose not to seek medical treatment and instead pushed her into a disgusting ritual that resulted in her end. This entire case was, of course, utterly bizarre, and it completely captivated me, which is why I had to dedicate an episode to it. If you enjoyed this video, please be sure to hit that like button as it truly helps support the channel, and subscribe if you haven't already. Also, please let me know in the comments. Do you prefer longer or shorter true crime stories? Your answer to that question is really important, as it helps me choose the type of content I focus on creating for you in the future. That's all for now. I'll see you in the next video.